All right, let me go sync. Sweet. Welcome to the Monkey Dance Podcast. How's that for an intro?
Yeah.
This is Ohan.
This is Guilherme.
And we're sitting here with Akos, an expert in mental martial arts, the mental martial arts of misinformation and lying, and also the physical martial art of kendo. Do you want to tell us what you do?
Yeah, sure. So I'm studying right now at the prestigious Department of Cognitive Science here at CU, and my topic is basically, well, it used to be mainly fake news, and then as you progress with your own topic, you just sort of realize that you have to kind of open up towards lying and dishonesty in general. And I'm interested in the broad history of fake news and just dishonesty, and then media history as well as psychology, and maybe a little bit of futurology. We'll see about that, I guess. No pun intended.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
Do you want to start us off with what lying is?
Sure. A bunch of linguists probably take my hat for characterizing it this way, because it's just been an issue that they're debating over and over and over again. But the main sort of definition that I can give you is that someone asserts something that is false, they know it to be false, and they assert it with the intent to cause a false belief in the person who's listening to that assertion, basically. So there is a false assertion, there is a belief to be false from the side of the communicator, and there is an intent to deceive.
Why do the linguists would take issue with this definition?
Because we have a bunch of competing sort of expressions that sort of denote the same things. Like we have deception as well, and we have misleading. And these sort of expressions also find their ways into like legislations, and at one point they need to be used by, courts when they make decisions, for example. And it's not obvious which expression to use in which contexts. And it's a debate where to delineate these different expressions, basically. And this is actually something that is reflected in how we talk about fake news, disinformation, and misinformation as well. So the same sort of issues come up there, mostly with regards to intent.
Okay, so the linguist definition would be more nuanced, that's what you say?
There definitely have been arguing about it for a longer time. And the main issue with lying would be an explicit assertion of false content. So would you consider leaving out information that you think that the other person should know as lying, or you would consider that as just manipulation of information that would be deception? So that's sort of the thing that linguists like to argue about when it comes to
in regard to that?
Sorry?
In regard to that, within your definition, withdrawing information is not part of...
So when information appears in the media, then we start talking about fake news and misinformation and disinformation, and there, everything just falls under the broad category of disinformation. So that would be something that encompasses both lying and deception. So deception would be like any sort of manipulation of information that induces a false belief, while you're knowing that how you manipulate the information is includes some sort of a dishonesty. That would be the big category. Right. And then misleading would be like you might assert something false, but you don't have the belief that it is false. You just could be like an incompetent communicator. You may genuinely believe something that is false, and you're just concerned about the other person, so you just assert something that is false. And then you have these cases that only exists in the minds of the philosophers, that something asserts something that they believe to be false, but it's actually true. And then how do you evaluate that? And occasionally, incidentally, it can happen, sure, and that's when these definitions become a little bit murky.
Right, like because then you have to include intent.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's really difficult because there's no way to ascertain that.
No.
I mean, everything else you can judge, but the intent, the inner state of the individual.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so then what's lying's relationship to, I mean, you kind of covered it, but can you make it more explicit to misinformation and disinformation in today's media environment?
Yeah. So similarly how it was with linguists, there were like a bunch of media scholars from 2015 onwards, with the lead of this journalist called Claire Wardle. One of her main intent was to bring everyone to the same linguistic platform when they talk about bad quality information appearing in the media. And her basic characterization was that there is misinformation, there is disinformation, and there is malinformation, the third category, which is not very often talked about, but it's very, very important in understanding this information. Misinformation would basically be any sort of bad quality or decontextualized information. It may or may not be spread with the intent to deceive, but it's just there. It's going to end up in deceiving someone, but we just cannot say for sure. Someone might have just shared that information for entertainment value, for the lols, for example. That's what they used to say. And then disinformation would be the malevolent type of communication in which there is an intent to deceive, and you're sharing that information specifically because of that. And then with relation, but we're still talking about bad quality information, decontextualized information. With malinformation, we're actually talking about true information, private information very often, which is shared with the intent to harm someone.
It's like doxing.
Or revenge porn. That would be the case. And what's interesting about the relationship with these three expressions is that disinformation very often obviously tries to parade as malinformation. It's very often mixed with malinformation as well in order to make the lie more believable. So there is this very infamous example of that happened in the French elections when Macron was first elected. There was a leak of like private emails and stuff like that during the presidential campaign, and it was malinformation, but they put fabricated fake information in the middle of that in order to co-opt the believability of malinformation that was also present. And this is like top shit KGB kind of tactics, actually. So they also sort of did this very, very often. So there is this interesting connection between disinformation and malinformation.
So you get this situation where people are attempting to dress up disinformation by making it seem like it's also more intimate or personal information that they have access to.
Yeah.
Right. So something like that would be like somebody's sexual exploits outside of marriage, which is like a hot thing these days in politics, right?
Yeah.
Okay, right.
It's always been.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's fair.
One of the first smear campaigns in history that we have on record is the campaign against Mark Antony in ancient Rome by Octavian, and he was using a very interesting medium for sexual allegations, which was that they put it on coins, they put it on money. That, I don't know, and Mark Antony had these weird religious beliefs that he was lecherous and all this sort of stuff. So it's very, very old that it's been going on in politics. Cleopatra, exact same stuff.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I guess that's a good segue into giving us a bit more of a history of misinformation.
Yeah.
Can we get just one step back?
No,
I really wanted Akos to put it on in a question form. What's the thing that you're trying to answer? So what's the most pressured question that you have right now?
For me, we can get to like how the psychology of fake news and how the field looks right now, which is, I think, quite interesting. And for me, the main stuff would be identifying the strategies of deceiving people en masse that actually work. And I would like to see how, if these strategies work, what do they tell about the human mind's information processing capacities, basically. And then obviously a long-term goal would be, the basic question is like, okay, how do we defend ourselves against these kind of tactics? The difficulty of this is that these constantly evolving. So there's this arms race between communicators who want to deceive others and people who try to avoid being deceived. And this arms race has been raging on since humans are able to communicate, basically.
And that's a nice hook to tell us a little bit on how did it evolved? What's the historical context that we have?
So I've been on a hunt for the oldest fake news that I can identify. Let's say the oldest disinformation. And the one of my favorite examples came from ancient Egypt, like 1200 BC, something like that. That was a really famous Egyptian pharaoh called Ramesses II. And he has had this huge battle with another empire called the Hittite Empire. At a place, they had a battle at a place called Kadesh. It was one of the biggest battle ever fought with chariots. They had records that the sand was, I don't know, red from blood for miles and miles and miles. And what happened was that it was an inconclusive battle that he suffered. At one point, he even had to flee the battlefield, the pharaoh. And just the forces just retreated after a few days, and both sides suffered very heavy casualties. And what Ramesses did was that he went back to Egypt. He hired a scribe called Pentaur to write a heroic poem about how he single-handedly won the entire battle for the empire. And they put this heroic poem on obelisks, on the walls of churches. They distributed it far and wide for people to see. And they essentially managed to fool historians for like 3,000 years. We thought that Ramesses II indeed won the Battle of Kadesh, while this was not really the case, and we only figured this out in like the 19th century. So for me, this would be like, there is obviously an assertion of false content there. There is an intent to deceive for all sorts of prestige-related reasons. Obviously, pharaohs considered themselves as being gods, so a god cannot be seen as losing a battle. And he would put this information on mediums, publicly available mediums at the time for everyone to see. And that's where you get from like normal lying in between two people towards, using a medium and distributing your own message to the public. And then, like 1 year ago, I had a student on my course, and I mentioned this example to the class, and hold on, I can do you better. I can give you an older one. And she showed me a bunch of cave paintings from the Amazon basin, which is today's Colombia, 20,000 BC. And archaeologists and anthropologists were showing that they put these murals and rock paintings strategically to sort of denote the territory of a tribe that they call themselves the Jaguar Man or something like that. And they depicted fantastic animals and like enormous battle scenes and things that most probably never happened. And one of the hypotheses is that they did this to repel the other tribes from their territories by using these lies that in this territory you're going to meet these humongous creatures who actually never existed, and they're going to hunt you and whatnot. And that would, we never know for sure. Obviously, it could have had for religious reasons, but it's a pretty good hypothesis, and I would sort of consider this like as a essentially more than 20,000-year-old fake news. But really, the period of interest for me when this whole thing is just sort of blowing up is the 19th century. When 19th century in the West, we can talk about the emergence of mass media, lots of people becoming suddenly literate. There is a decreasing central control over the press as well. There are all sorts of technological inventions like the rotary printing machine that allows for 20,000 copies and stuff like that. And it's just suddenly all these factors come together, and there is a boom in the copies of journals and how many journals there are. And the early press, the early mass media press, is notoriously unreliable because they transform into vehicles of entertainment, basically. So this is what they do. One of the most infamous hoaxes was about a race of bad people living on the moon. This is the moon hoax or something like this, and they would go with these stories and talk about people who painted or people who tattooed a spider on his scalp to scare away flies, and all these sort of sensationalist stories, because this was the thing that could get them a really, really quick return on their investment. As you have these newsboys, distributing the papers on street corners, and around 1880, there was a new owner of the New York Times, and he realized that, well, people are buying all these entertaining so-called yellow newspapers, but maybe if they were given a chance between entertainment and actually reliable information for the same price, then they would go for reliable information, and he was proven to be right. So that was their way of sort of curating this suddenly very chaotic information environment. There's a lot of available information in journals and articles and opinions and all this sort of stuff, and a lot of people who can read them. And what's important about this is that these different, we can call them economical models, basically coexist next to each other. So there are still, yellow papers and entertainment newspapers and tabloid newspapers. There are still propagandistic newspapers, and there are some newspapers that are sort of reliable curators of information with like transparent editorial guidelines and methodologies, and disclosing the facts and disclosing their methods of getting those facts.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you talk about early print media, like the boom of print media, it really sounds like the early internet.
Yeah, exactly.
So like the early internet was rife with that kind of thing.
Exactly.
And I think we're still kind of sorting out some of the hoaxes that were pushed in the early internet.
Sure.
From vaccine inadequacy, moon landing conspiracies, JFK's assassination had like a resurgence. Yeah. But the other thing is, and this maybe touches upon the nuances of the type of work you do, is that when you become a credible media outlet, then you also become a potential propaganda machine. In that a credible outlet could be used, manipulated for the benefit of any political party or any corporation. Yeah. And we see that with a lot of major media in the United States, for example, but really all around the world, where any business person or politician can then take over the outlet, or even if they don't take it over, influence it. And lead it to publish things that serve its right.
Exactly.
So then you have this problem of, in the same way that people can inject misinformation into malinformation, they can also inject propaganda into an otherwise credible information.
Sure. Yeah. So, and if you, for example, look at how professional disinformation campaigns are usually done from the Philippines to the US to Russia and all these other places, their main strategic goal is that the narrative that they have written be picked up by a reliable media outlet. That's goal number one. If you manage to do that, then you co-opted the prestige of a reliable source, and from that point onwards, the information can really sort of explode. And so basically one of the early things that I've done in my research was trying to show that this whole digitalization and digital era and digital journalism, the problems that we're facing right now, are not new. Whenever there is a new technological invention, like they were with printing in the 19th century and telegrams and all this sort of stuff, photography being invented, we have handled situations like this before. And whenever there is a new communication invention, one of the first things that people will do with it is that they try to use it for lying, basically. That is like a universal rule in history. And then we just sort of trying to catch up with the liars and try to come up with methods to counteract them. And one of the scary things about the internet and digitalization, which this is where the similarities end, is that in the 19th century, the person who wanted to create a reliable outlet could match the selling price of the fakes, and that's no longer true in the internet. This information is never hid behind a paywall. So essentially, consuming bad quality information is zero price if you have internet access, but reliable information curation is still costly. So that is a price that you cannot really match. And if you want your journals to be independent from from the government, or if you want them to be independent from corporate interests, then you have to rely on readership subscriptions. But the problem is that we have a norm on the internet that information should be free. So whoever is setting up a paywall is going to be most probably killing their own business and pushing readers away from them. But reliable information curation is still costly. So how are you going to pay your journalists? Where you're going to rely on clicks and you're going to rely on advertisements. And once you rely on advertisements, you're no longer impartial. And if you're no longer impartial, then your factuality is in danger.
Yeah, and I think that's why, for example, a place like Twitter is having a resurgence again. X. A lot of people left the platform, but it is an incredible platform in that people get access to information for free from sources that they deem reliable.
Yeah.
It's so subjective, but and so you have direct access to somebody that is reliable absent a paywall. And you can find people's Substacks, and it seems like Substack is also growing, like places to find journalists who are actually putting out weekly breakdowns of stuff for free, and then having like freemium models as well. But that type of access is so crucial. So we have this interesting problem where we're in a moment where new technology has been created, and a lot of people in the present moment don't know how to deal with it, right? But the generation that always follows that always seems a bit more immune. So the generation that was first around when yellow journalism begins was not immune at all. And then their children are like, come on, guys, this is obvious, because they grow up within the environment. Yeah. Do you think that might happen with something like AI, where everybody in this generation might be fucked in that they can't tell the difference between what's real and what's fake? Yeah. Do you think that future generations, a kid born today, by the time they're an adult, might have a better time at least being skeptical, not discerning, because discernment might be impossible, but the skeptical nature might improve, and they might look to other sources that are more credible?
Right. So what I can tell is that, we do have some evidence about the fact that there are definitely generational differences in how people process information and how much they believe information that is being presented on the internet. But on the other hand, newer generations are not seem to be doing super well. So there was this enormous study conducted in the US, I think by Stanford, but I'm not entirely sure, in which they were showing that like 50-60% of undergrad students were unable to tell the difference between an advertisement and a genuine news article. So you have certain problems in newer generations as well. The scope of the problem is up for debate a little bit right now in the literature, but I would say that it's my psychological hypothesis behind this would be that we're vulnerable because we just sort of lose track of how much investment does it take to curate and present information on these platforms. So for example, my grandparents would look at TV, and whatever is being on TV is true just because they saw how difficult it is to get in TV and how much work goes in it. And when they see, a YouTube video, they sort of think that the same investment had to go in creating this content as well. And the newer generations no longer have this because they just understand how really, really easy it is to shoot a video about something. So I think it comes with understanding these technologies and essentially the communicational investment that goes into creating content.
I guess there's something there where kids who are in college are no more than 15, 20 years younger than us. So it might be that we need to wait another 20 years that they can get to that point, because it's still so new and it's evolving so fast. Yeah. And it might be that we increasingly rely on institutions, which then is also potentially dangerous just because of how institutions can be manipulated, bought and sold. But then maybe it's something where we end up looking back towards individuals. Like there was a turn towards, in the United States, we had Walter Cronkite, like a famous, and it's not like he was particularly accurate, but people turned to individual reliable sources for their information because they felt like the media landscape was such a mess. Do you see that as something that's a potential salve for this kind of current situation?
So people are already doing this, especially people who are not necessarily super cynical about the information environment, but more like they don't really know what's going on. they don't really know who have vested interest in communicating information. And one of the things that's been noted early in the 2000s was an increased reliance on user-generated content. So they turn towards sources who are not professional journalists and experts because they don't have corporate interests and they don't do it for the money, so maybe we can trust them more. The problem is that with AI technologies and with, anonymous profiles, you can hack the source. You can just create sources that didn't exist. I mean, for example, LinkedIn is rife with people who never existed and supposedly applying for jobs just in order to make some corporations look more legitimate than they actually are. So there is a danger in turning towards this user-generated content, but I would personally still argue for trying to better the existing institutions in order to handle this, rather than somehow trying to update the human mind itself. That's really a way longer process to do. And the way how we handled previous crises in the communication environment was that we came up with better institutions because they evolve and react quicker than the human mind can, right? You can update an editorial guideline and make it transparent way quicker than you could update the information curation or processing system of a human. So cultural evolution is quicker than biological evolution, is what I'm saying. And I would try to make existing institutions stronger.
But I guess my concern is something like institutions move so much slower than individual people. And institutions then, because they're amalgamations of so many people, the biases that those individuals maintain within the institutions are not transparent.
Right.
Whereas an individual journalist, even if they have biases, I'd rather know what they are and then take all of their information through that lens.
Right.
I guess that's why I have a little bit more faith. I have a lot more skepticism in journalistic outlets as institutions,
right,
and a lot more faith in individual journalists.
So I always go back to this example, but there was a study in the 80s from a pioneering media scholar called Paula Shoemaker, and basically she's done this. She went to like maybe it was the Washington Post, I'm not entirely sure, and she just checked whether the output of a journal, of an institution, would reflect the individual biases of the people who were curating the information. And she found that it was not the case. And it was not the case because of the methodology that was enforced by the journal to curate information. And this is the argument that I think a lot of people sort of need to understand, that, yeah, everyone have their biases. Journalists have their biases. Scientists have their own biases when they interpret the data, potentially, even when they generate the data. But it's not the individual who needs to be unbiased. It is the methodology that the individual is using which needs to approximate some level of unbiasedness. So it's really about the methodology, and the methodology can be updated, the methodology should be transparent, and the methodology needs to be enforced by the institution and needs to be double checked. That's why you have editors, that's why you have chief editors in journals and whatnot. So that's why we sort of refer to it as a distributed cognitive system, because the output is more than the simple aggregation of its parts.
For sure. I mean, I definitely get the point of structure and institutionalizing something like a removal of biases. I think one of my problems is the fact that they are not immune then to editors circulating demands from their editorial staff as to what kind of things they're allowed to publish and the types of slants they have to take, which we know has happened in the Washington Post, in the New York Times, where they take a stance that aligns with a particular political agenda. And I think when we see that, then that erodes my trust a bit more, because it's clear to me when a journalist has a particular opinion, but I don't know what the internal memos are unless somebody leaks them. So while I do have faith in humans working together, distributing the cognitive load, trying to then mitigate the biases, which I do think naturally happens in some sense. I think it's also important to realize that there's no full way to mitigate the risk of power dynamics that exist in institutions.
Yeah. One way of handling this is, you can say that no matter what we do, there's still going to be some bias in the output of an institution. What we can do is that we can use algorithms or even an AI to diversify people's media diets. And then they would not be reliant on merely one institution, but maybe 2 or 3 institutions that have slightly different guidelines, and then they can have a better, potentially less biased picture on what's going on.
Yeah. Right on.
So that would be something that we could do. That was this interesting thing that happened a few years ago. The BBC developed something that they call the public service algorithm. It was implemented in one of their radio channels, and it really didn't work well. But the main idea was that we should approximate an individual's preferences with regards to what they like to listen and what kind of opinions do they align with. And then every now and then, we should insert content which is good quality, but they wouldn't necessarily agree with it. And unfortunately, I don't think that they had the actual psychological knowledge to know how to pull this off, because the more radical a person is and the more radical their opinion is, the less, you cannot do this so often with them as with a person who's not that radical. And they I think they just had like one number that for every 4 content that you agree with, you're going to have 1 which you disagree with. And that doesn't work for every person. So you have to write an algorithm that weighs how radical people are and takes this into account. I don't think that they've done this, so they finally axed the whole program. But I think it was still a sort of good idea to try to debias people using algorithms, because if you argue that algorithms can be used to create filter bubbles and opinion bubbles, then they can be used to pop them out as well. Because, these are just tools. It's up to us what we're using them for.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I came upon the same conclusion. I mean, I use a news aggregator with all the sources that I pick, and that includes sources that I don't agree with at all.
Sure.
Just so I can get a sense of what the context is. But I think that maybe we can transition into then why do you think that doesn't work? Like cognitively, what are the psychological mechanisms that make you think like, okay, this is... if I was doing this kind of project, these are the ways that I would be able to improve upon that project as a cognitive scientist.
Oh dear. So one of the main questions, I'm guessing, would be how to evade confirmation bias with regards to people opinion, and I don't really have a ready-made answer for that, unfortunately. And I would agree with the part of the literature that's saying that confirmation bias is not something irrational. So people stockpile information that they agree with because they understand that later on they can use that to convince someone, and they can recruit people for their own coalitions and stuff like that. So it's kind of a rational process. How do you go against this sort of rational process is quite difficult. It's quite difficult. You can put in, education, and for example, the European Union is putting a lot of money and effort into digital literacy and media literacy programs with sort of varying results. But yeah, that's a main question. Is a really, really difficult question. I would make more use of algorithmic debiasing, probably. You can definitely make use of large language systems and models, to aggregate the news for you, to fact check for you. There are some people over in the US at Cornell University who are really pushing towards something that they call accuracy prompts. Just basically every now and then you're being presented with a little bit of a priming saying that just be mindful of the accuracy that the information that you're encountering. And that just simple prompt seems to work in a psychological sense that we're not talking about enormous effect sizes, but like 10%, 15%, something like that, which is reasonable in the field that we're working on. One of the very interesting things that I found from the same group actually is debiasing and debunking conspiracy theories using large language models. There's been just a very, very interesting paper published on this one. What they essentially done was that they made people sit down with an AI and people who were conspiracy theory believers, and they told the AI to be very, very respectful in how they respond to these people, which would be potentially difficult for a person to do who doesn't believe in these conspiracy theories. But what the AI doesn't believe in anything, so it's easy for it, and you can just give it like a sort of a structure of how to respond to a person respectfully. And their idea was that, conspiracy theorists often boast that we do our own research, and they really go into the details of on what Celsius do steel beams melt in 9/11 conspiracy theories. And when you try to argue with them as a person, it's really, really difficult to address specifically the information that prompted them to believe in these conspiracy theories. But the AI has all the information in the world. And they can just, whatever you put it in them, it can, if it works well, obviously, it can just debunk the ideas that pushed you towards a conspiracy, saying that, yeah, I understand why you would believe this, and I understand what made you believe this, but we have this sort of data that is saying otherwise. And for a psychological study, they have, managed to get enormous effect size, like over 20% or something like this, in decreasing conspiracist beliefs that were previously thought to be unmovable. So I think we can make use of the technologies that we're having, that we're so afraid of. I mean, everyone is talking about AI as something that is going to create disinformation on a scale that we have never seen, stuff like that. But it can also be used for very, very good things. It can be used for debiasing. These are just powerful tools, and we can use them however we want, to reiterate the previous point.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really fun idea. That also touches upon some of the work that I do with validation, how removing uncertainty, social uncertainty, can relax people's beliefs.
Yeah.
And it's cool to be able to use an AI to do that. It's nice to, like you pointed out, be able to use AI to implement some of the things that we've learned on the cognitive end. In sort of impacting the psychological profiles of people around us.
And also, it's just, when a conspiracy theory believer, let's say someone who's really, really radicalized, comes up with someone else who's arguing against their point, they would have this feeling that maybe this person is attacking me. But they know that the AI is not a person, unless they have some conspiracy theories about what huge corporation has created the AI and then can give rise to a future problem of which AI you're believing, and then we're just essentially continuing the same kind of arms race that we've been enclosed in since the beginning of human communication. But nonetheless, people have a little bit of a less biased view about large language models than an actual person arguing against their views. And I think that is a huge factor, and we should just sort of measure people's beliefs and how they personify and anthropomorphize the AI, maybe as like an implicit anti-fake news and anti-conspiracy kind of education. We can teach people how these AI systems work, and then they would be less prone to think that someone created them from malevolent end, because they're essentially just a collage machine that is working on weighting information. It's nothing to do with how the human mind works. So, and I think that in this specific situation of debunking information and debunking conspiracy theories, this is an asset.
Yeah, the sad thing is that there's already a narrative that all the AI tools that are being created are woke. There's already this narrative that they're being created by progressive companies, which is a ridiculous concept that Google could be progressive, or OpenAI. But like there's this idea, so then they're already sowing the seeds of mistrust. And we might get into a point where, again, it's just another one of the institutions that are then not trusted. So do you foresee a way to get to a point where there's no way to undercut the validity that people ascribe, the epistemic validity, to an institution in order to serve their own ends. So I'm going to undercut the validity of the New York Times or of ChatGPT in order to make an assertion that they're both controlled by liberal media, and therefore you should believe this thing. Because the sources that you are getting, from the judges making certain orders to the newspapers giving you the information, all of that's been corrupted by an agenda that's outside of your control. Do you see a way beyond that? Because that's the most successful way people get people to believe what they want, is they sow doubt.
Yeah. So this is going to be a bit of an indirect answer, but I don't think that people who have that level of decreased trust got to that level because of the media. I think there is some underlying issue there, what makes people lose trust in institutions, in their societies, economic inequality, institutionalized racism, the real big problems. Fake news is not the biggest problem in the world, despite the fact of all the scientists who are giving an enormous amount of grant money on this. It's not the biggest problem in the world. There are way bigger problems than this. I don't know, global warming, stuff like that. And, people feeling disenfranchised, and people feel like that they're being left behind, people being stuck in bullshit jobs, they're not being paid well, and they don't really understand what the meaning of the job that they're doing, because it probably doesn't have any. And if we want to handle this situation, then we shouldn't necessarily start with the media, but with addressing the issues that cause the distrust in the institutional system in the first place. So fake news and conspiracy theories, and this is something that's been repeated in the literature many, many times, is a symptom of deeper social issues that you can find in a society.
I mean, not surprisingly, we are on the exact same page with that. You put that really, really well.
Yeah. Maybe stepping back again, I was hearing you, and I just notice things being conflated all the time within questions and answers, which is, to start with, you put a lot of weight on the newslet, so the means of distribution of information, right? Which were not there throughout the whole evolutionary history of our species. So those are new technologies that enable you to, or whatever you have to say, to reach out more people. Mm-hmm. And so there is this part on where we're talking about something that probably we've been doing since we are humans, which is lying. Yeah. And then we have something in the environment, which is the capacity to
lie to a lot of people.
Is that the only? So we have some psychological underpinnings on this first part, on the lying part, right? That's, and I assume that you would be aiming to understand parts of it, of what's happening there. Why do we believe lies? And then when you add to something in the environment, just to put aside the whole socio-ecological environment, which is complex enough, which permeates everything else. But when you put it the news outlet or the printing machine or whatever, is the just taking the psychological toolkit that we evolved to and applying it to a scale, or there is something else. It's just the scale of how many people can communicate. It's just the same processes going on. Right. And then we add scale, or because you have been talking about the prestige of the source and how there
I get you.
Strategies and things, but like how do you see it?
I get you. What is it that changed from lying? Basically, there is also this very simple. So I'm going to start from a little bit further away, but if I understand correctly, the question is that there can be an evolutionary mismatch hypothesis here.
It could be.
Basically, that we have some, I would argue, and some other people in my field would argue and agree with me on this one, that we have some evolved capacities to keep human communication sufficiently honest. We call this, not very poetically, epistemic vigilance. They could have come up with a better name. Anyways, and what happens is that we this capacity evolved to assess verbal face-to-face communication because that's how we communicated most in our evolutionary history for millions of years, and this slowly started changing in the past few hundred years. So maybe we're not as adept in assessing written information or pictorial information as we would in assessing verbal lying. And what I think is happening is that there could be some truth in this one. The pictures do have a little bit of a persuasive advantage over verbal stuff, just because we think that it's, like especially if it's a photograph, then it's non-testimonial evidence. We don't really think about the fact that the picture is also framing things out of reality in a way how the communicator wants to frame it. But I think what happens is that we distribute these capacities to institutions in order to handle this new information environment for us. And some of the editorial stuff that are going on in institutions and in journals mimic very closely of what an individual would do with their epistemic vigilance. So there is an institutionalized version of this psychological capacity distributed over hundreds of people who are, followed guidelines, and they develop these guidelines whenever there is a new technological change. So this sort of institutionalized version of epistemic vigilance can, to a certain extent, evolve quicker and react quicker than the private psychological capacity that takes potentially hundreds and thousands of years to change. Now, with that being said, with regards to also previous point that Orhan mentioned with sowing doubt, I'm currently working on a sort of communicational model which I think and a deception tactic that I think is new, and it only happened because of digitization. And this is basically a communicational model in which you communicate loads of bullshit. You flood the information environment with bullshit because you can, because it's cheap, like it's never been so cheap ever before to reach millions of people. And you don't really care what you communicate. Your communicational output can be even, incompatible with each other. You can make it look like that they all come from different sources. And what you're interested in is not what people believe. You're not interested in persuading them. What you're interested in is in decreasing trust in actually reliable information and increasing the costs of curating reliable information. Because you just, to quote Steve Bannon, you just flood the zone with shit. And I think this is something that's new. And it's very, very counterintuitive to think about that you don't communicate to persuade someone. You communicate to confuse someone in their actually reliable beliefs, or in their ability to curate information, or in their competency to somehow reach reliable information in the media ecosystem. I think that this is something new, and it was made possible because of digitization, and it made possible because it's just so cheap to create content and distribute content most of the time. And for that one, I'm not entirely sure how we should be reacting. Definitely, fact checking doesn't seem to be a good answer to that one, because it's just like coming against a horde of locusts with a fly sweater. Basically, it's just, you're not gonna be able to do that. And weirdly enough, when I look at sort of historical sources of how professional disinformers do things, these notions of persuading people and convincing people, brainwashing them en masse, is notoriously absent from how they talk about this. They talk about sowing doubt. They talk about decreasing trust. They talk about making people uncertain. And that is just something weird, something counterintuitive about what is happening with human communication on social media. I'm not sure that whether we're quite ready for that one. And because we have this intuitive idea of how human communication works and how fake news should be working, if someone sees some bullshit and they believe that bullshit for some reason, I think we should switch to an understanding in which we look at what happens with reliable information when it is in the context of a lot of bullshit that you're just uncertain about. And also, once a person becomes uncertain and once things become ambiguous, that's not really a situation or a mindset that is comfortable for people to hold. So what are they going to do next if they become uncertain? What are the kind of sources that they're going to turn to? What is the information that becomes attractive for them in a very uncertain and ambiguous media environment? It could be conspiracy theories, actually, because that is very attractive information for humans. So if I want to just sort of overlook this sort of question that, yeah, we have these psychological capacities. At one point in time, we distributed these psychological capacities to institutions, and the institutions bettered them and made them more quicker and adaptive and reactive to the environment. And now we're having this weird new media environment in which something new is happening again with communication. And I'm not quite sure how to react to this one. But there are definitely similarities with how lying look like. You can make so how I made a connection between lying and disinformation. You can also make a connection between bullshitting and flooding. So bullshitting was this, notion from Frankfurt that you're just polluting the other person's mind with saying bullshit. But there was also verbal face-to-face communication. When it happens on a larger scale and mass, then it sort of becomes, with multiple seemingly independent sources involved, then it becomes flooding. So we adapt these strategies to changing media environments as well, and we're changing communication with it. Yeah.
Is there a chance that it's not necessarily a bad thing, like the flooding part? Because if the system is so difficult to tease apart, information, already our platforms are so flooded with information, it's difficult to tease apart what's good and what's bad. Would this get maybe more people to feel that they need to take a break from certain platforms because it's just so confusing, there's so much, and then reduce their information input to a few sources that they already deem reliable?
Right. It can happen, and this is something that I'm trying to measure in an experiment of mine currently with not much success, that instead of trying to measure how people react to information, I'm also trying to measure what they come to believe about the information environment in which they met that information. And that is not something that is being usually measured, like how difficult it is to navigate an environment. And I see that there's a lot of bullshit going on. I feel like I'm being overloaded by this platform and stuff like that. And it's not only that people have beliefs about information, that when that's being presented, they also come to believe other things about the communication environment in general, and that's going to feed back to the information again that they see on the platforms as well. So if they come to believe that Facebook is totally unreliable, then they're going to decrease their trust to the information that is being presented in there, supposedly. And I'm trying to sort of get to this, but to answer your question, it can have some beneficial health, stuff that people may be spending a little bit more time off from social media. But on the other hand, there is this danger that if they come to believe that the news media is untrustworthy and we just cannot curate it, eventually they're going to turn to sources that are very, very dubious. They try to parade as being completely impartial. They are hiding stuff, not being transparent with how they curate information, and you can push people towards Infowars or something like that. And how I think about this, and I don't have evidence on this, but I think if people have this uncertainty about their media environments, they would turn eventually to sources who with very, very strong claims about, I can tell you what's going on. I know the one truth in this whole chaos that you're forced to exist in. And that's not necessarily the kind of epistemic humility that you want to look forward. There's always going to be uncertainty, even in good reporting. And if it's good reporting, then that uncertainty is addressed. But if you're already living in an information environment that is uncertain, then uncertainties might not be the most attractive for you to hear. Instead, very strong epistemic claims about, I know the one truth and the one truth only. And I think that's sort of what happens with people who are fatigued by this media environment.
I guess it can go either way. Like in that there is the growth of people turning away from mainstream media outlets and shifting more towards like small-scale progressive outlets, and then also small-scale sort of conservative outlets. And they're not necessarily conspiratorial. Like I know my media consumption has moved much smaller, much more independent. But I think you raise a really interesting point in that conspiracy theories is sort of a domain where both of our work overlaps. So one of the things that I think is the most appealing about conspiracy theories is they, like you said, make what's difficult to understand seem understandable. And the world is difficult to understand in that there are so many moving parts, and there isn't a single agenda, and there are so many institutions, and the institutions all have individuals in them, and they all have individuals with their own agendas. So there's no 7 people running Earth from a boardroom. But it's so appealing to be able to understand things, and that's a big part of the work that we do on curiosity and this sort of Goldilocks effect. That's what it's called in curiosity, where if it's too simple and understandable, it's not interesting. I could tell you things you already know. It's not going to make you listen. And I could also start rattling off things that are completely indecipherable to you, either speaking a different language or speaking about a field which none of us know anything about. But there's a middle ground, which is all of the things that I can access through metaphor or through the information I already have, the expertise I already have, which is that middle zone for the Goldilocks for curiosity. Conspiracy theorists somehow are really good at a good conspiracy theory builds a narrative that fits right in there. Gives you a bunch of things that are intuitive, metaphors, sit really well, help you understand things.
It gives you a lot of things that are actually true, but it's just sort of mixed up with false information. It's something
and it resolves things that true information doesn't resolve. It resolves things obviously in a way that's fabricated, but it does offer resolution, and then it posits 1 or 2 new uncertainties. And that's the really interesting balance.
Okay. So just to turn back to, we can go to conspiracy theories. I love to talk about them. So it's completely fine. It's just that, with regards to turning to these small outlets, one of the, and it was a journalist, actually not an academic writing or anything like that, but a journalist, an older journalist friend of mine from Britain made me understand this, that a tragedy happened with digitization in journalism, and that was the death of local journalism. That's sort of the worst thing that can happen. You would have these small little journals, and politicians would compete to be covered by them, and then they had some manpower in checking the claims and going after and doing local investigative work in these local journals. And once Facebook hits, a politician can just create their own profile. They can now communicate to the masses directly without having to organize a rally or a campaign or anything like that. And local journalism is slowly just kind of died out. And we were left with these monsters like New York Times or Washington Post. And, people don't really feel like these outlets are covering their interests, because they're just too big to concentrate on local issues, and that also propels them towards sort of turning away from it, because this media is not for me. Just to quote Van Jones, people don't care about what you have to say unless you show that you care about them. And that's precisely what local news media did. That it was about the issues in your little town in England somewhere, and then you felt close, you felt like you're being covered, you felt that you're being interested, the local stories were printed, whatever, I don't know, there was a nice Independence Day celebration in the kindergarten, stuff like that, which made people feel closer to the media. It felt like the media was actually about them. And with the death of local journalism, they just went out of the window, and that's bad. That's really bad. If Facebook created some really, really bad effects, it was definitely this. So
that's exactly what happened in the United States. Every town would have their own newspaper, but now those have collapsed. And something that's been happening that's really insidious is that there's this one big right-wing organization that has been buying up small outlets and then rebranding under a major outlet's name. And then they have so Fox News has so many local channels around the United States. And what they do is give 1 or 2 segments about the town, which doesn't cost them much. and then the rest of it is nationalized programming. So they give you that sense of community. They get you to, hear about your public school.
That is insidious.
Oh man! And then it's just like the national propaganda.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. You mentioned something that I think is interest to explore a little bit more, which is you mentioned the character of cognitive distribution. When I asked what is there about the psychological underlying processes regarding lying, and what is that within the new environment on which communication is produced and distributed, and you mentioned there will be cognitive processes such as epistemic vigilance that can be reproduced within those institutions or new institutions by distributing cognitive labor.
Yes.
Right? But what I find provocative in this proposal is that institutions, they from what I understand, they would appeal to some psychological processes, some psychological tendencies or whatever, but they could not, or at least they are not a model of the cognitive process per se.
No.
So because there are other individuals involved, right? So there is expectation of what other individuals will do with the rules and norms within this. So it's more complex than that. So it's not a reproduction of a cognitive process as a tool to deal with the different environment, right? So but it seems like when you were talking, actually, it seems like that you create those parallels kind of things. So, but this person didn't trust the source anymore. And then what I can think is just, okay, so if we take this specificity of the environment, then what we have is trusting the source. Or if we are in a tribe and you're lying to me, So you already have been hinting it. So it's not. It is. Yes. No. Yeah. But exactly how do you go about that then? Because if the cognitive processes are one, and institutions, as much as you would like to try to create analogies for what cognitive processes is something different.
Yes. Yeah.
So where is the reconciliation there?
So one thing that you need to keep in mind is still institutions are the main building blocks of institutions are minds that have their own epistemic vigilance capacities. And I think that when they write editorial guidelines, for example, and codify these editorial guidelines about how to process information inside the institutions, then they sort of take the rules and the inspiration from how their own mind works to a certain extent, but they do something extra there. You're right about that. So for example, I might distrust a source when we're in verbal communication based on certain kind of impression that I have, and there's going to be an underlying calculation that might not be conscious at all from my part. I might not even know the content of that calculation at all. But when you're a journalist, you have to disclose that. You can't just write down, if you're a quality journal, and a quality journalist is not going to go through the editorial check, that I have an impression that this source is lying. No, you have to go out of your way and you have to acquire some testimony that would allow you to definitely say that this person was being deceptive or misleading or something like that. So they do a little bit of an extra, and they do this because it's not really good evidence to say that I had an impression that this source is lying. And at the end of the day, it's not only that you curate the information, it's not only that you gather the information as a media, as a source, but you also have to present it in a way that is reliable and accessible for people. So no, there is no one-on-one overlap between the cognitive capacities and what they do. but the inspiration comes from there, definitely. And then you can see all sorts of stuff that you would do with the source, like me, for example, when you're asking questions from me and whatnot like that. So those things still rest on existing cognitive capacities. And then something else happens when you put them down in editorial guidelines and you have multiple people, all their own views and experiences trying to better those editorial guidelines. And you end up creating something that is arguably a lot more powerful than any of the individual's epistemic vigilance capacity. But still the basis of it and where the whole idea comes from is the cognitive processes. That's why it's attractive for us as well. Sort of answered the question.
Yes. I understand that we could call it kind of, even with cultural attraction theory, we can look at how specific cognitive process would kind of just like create this attractor towards a kind of institution that we need to deal with the cognitive process that we already have. So I agree with you on that. It's just that it seems that there's so much layers of things. When we have the institutions going on, especially and the technology, so it's hard to track.
Yes,
it's really hard for me to get a kind of a silver line, just like something that connects the thing as well as possible, because we have the whole socio-economic context in which it happens. You mentioned several times and how technology advances and how one generation does not know how to do that thing. So we do not even have the institutions are just crumbles of what we actually need them to deal with. So it's so many layers that I find I find myself quite skeptical to be able to find the cognition behind these layers of things. So I find that it's a nice proposition of yours that you can make the comparison. But
what you need to keep in mind is that when it comes to the representation of information, these institutions also have to appeal to the epistemic vigilance of their readers. It has to satisfy certain requirements for us to consider an output reliable. You would have to say that, for example, I ask multiple sources in order to present this information for you, and that's something that's going to be attractive for us because it satisfies the requirements of our own epistemic vigilance when it comes to accepting information. So I think that's sort of like a mark that something very similar is going on as what epistemic vigilance does. It assesses the source, it assesses the content, and those kind of tasks are also visible within these institutions, distributed over hundreds of people. You would have a lot more like when it comes to editors and chief editors, then essentially what they do is that they send back the information for further confirmation, and they would have multiple circles of, just chew on it a little bit more, just ask a little bit more people, that make it a lot more complex than actual epistemic vigilance. I mean, if you were to ask a single person to do that, it would be impossible, just like it would be impossible. That's the classic distributed cognition example. It would be impossible for one person to captain an enormous, icebreaker ship or something like that. It's similar with an institution like that. So the processing capacity required for presenting good quality news articles is way beyond what one person can do. But nonetheless, the main rules of how epistemic vigilance is working, or how we theorize epistemic vigilance is working in the mind, are the same rules that you can find in the institutions. And it is because it is being done by people who have their own individual epistemic vigilance capacities. It is sometimes being done by things like open source investigative softwares, but those softwares were also developed with people who have minds. So there's going to be some overlaps in that. But yes, you're absolutely right. What is happening within a newspaper is if you look at it from the outside, all the little ants moving and sending back information and sending back information again for confirmation, and then finally something comes out, is more complex than what's happening with one individual's epistemic vigilance capacity when you just put in some information to check it. I might suffice, that I think this information is going to good enough for me in light of its relevance. But for a newspaper, you have subscribers and whatnot, and you have to satisfy their needs as well. So you go out of your way and you do extra work.
Off topic, it's still on topic. Are fairy tales or something like mothers telling their kids a story that will prevent them to go on the night in the forest or wherever they go before the press? Everything.
Would I consider them to be fake news?
Yes.
No, because the intent is not to deceive.
No, but the intent is to deceive. Like you wanted your kid to believe that there is a monster somewhere, the kid doesn't go there.
The intent is...
Or cautionary tales.
The intent, you could argue with me on this one, but I think the intent is to prevent your kid from getting harmed.
True. Deceiving.
That's still, yes.
So malicious intent is important.
Malicious intent.
Yes.
That's interesting.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a white lie, because that's what we'd call a white lie then.
Yes.
Like
Yeah.
It's a lie that I believe is for your own good.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's sort of like lubricant of society. Sometimes people say something
Definitely
like that,
that.
but Yeah.
Social cohesion is micro lies a big part of it.
Yes, there is all sorts of deception going on with people, and you can argue about how harmful these things are. But when it comes to media, it's usually not about white lies anymore.
But malicious intent, it can be tricky as well.
I mean, intent is already tricky to get to. So yeah.
I don't even give any credence to intent. Whenever I can devalue intent, because it also shifts in time. Like people's intent or what they perceive their intent to be or have been can shift over time as their beliefs change.
Sure.
We're constantly retelling our narratives of our lives. So you can paint yourself in a completely different light.
Yeah. And that's something that is, like linguistic models of deception. People are trying to do this. And one of the most interesting things that they started talking about mid-2010s with regards to something called information manipulation model is that when people start making an utterance, it's not like that, most of the time, it's not like that they consciously made an intent to deceive someone beforehand, like hours beforehand. Sometimes this happens, but very often they start talking to a person and they start a sentence and they see how they react, and they made an instantaneous decision that I'm going to insert a half-truth in here. I'm going to insert something deceitful in here because the person is not reacting the way how I imagined it or how I think they should be reacting. And one important observation, which sounded so counterintuitive to me the first time I was reading about this, is that we lie for the same reason as we tell the truth. We just want to change the other person's mind, and in certain strategic situations, we perceive deceit to be the best way of doing that. And
Yeah, wow, that's a really good way to put that. We lie for the same reasons that we tell the truth. That's phenomenal. I think the one thing also just about the institutions conversation is what gets lost when we abstract things, give names to collections of people, whether it be just the word group or the word institution or the word government, is we remove the human element from it.
Right.
Because everything that we interact with, that we speak about, is just individuals working and believing they have some kind of same goal. There's some kind of shared set of beliefs, even if it's not the totality. They're domain specific about that thing, so that all of their work is contributing to the existence of an institution, say. And then the only thing that's different about institutions, corporations, etc., is that there's documentation that has made explicit for people's then observed interpretations to be made that attempt to formalize the existence and the procedures of those things. And we call those things institutions.
Right.
So if you have collections of people who iron out what the purpose of their a behavior is.
Right.
It's literally just ironed out behavior. And then intentions behind the ironed out behavior. And then we just call that thing an institution. And that's sort of the really interesting aspect of the world that we go around, because the narratives that we tell is that there's a corporation doing this and there's an institution doing this. And yeah, maybe the output of the system is that. But I think when we treat it as systems, we lose some of the most important bits, which is work to think about all the time. We don't want to think about an institution as the individuals that make up the institution, because then we have to consider the fact that the institution is inherently flawed. But that the institution inherently doesn't have an opinion, can't be malicious or benevolent in its own. And that we have to actually judge things by the output. Rather than trying to judge the intent of an institution.
Right, consequentialist philosophy.
Yeah. In that at least that allows us to have a more skeptical, critical view of the institutions, the governments, the groups of individuals that we interact with. In a way which isn't to say that collections of human beings do amazing things all the time. And they do things that do have outputs which we can consider to be benevolent, beneficial for society. It's not that collections of humans don't do that, but we have to always think about it as collections of humans.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, what really makes this thing even more complex is that no individual human really thinks that they have malevolent intent. Everyone have their justifications behind thinking that I'm telling a lie for a good reason or something like that. So we can always just explain this away. Sometimes, I mean, most of the time we're not even really conscious about it, that we're harming someone. That's also part of but we just don't think about it. It's one of my main problems with cognitive dissonance theory, that people can live together with wildly incompatible information and beliefs in their heads without being conscious about it. The problem comes when these incompatibilities become public knowledge, and that's when you just have this, sudden boom of justifications and whatnot. But I'm going off topic.
No. I think that's really relevant. In that the moment that your belief is realized by you is the moment when it's also subject to change. It can be both defended, but then also updated in accordance. You can say, "Oh, I didn't realize I had these two conflicting things." It can not even be public, or I can just be thinking about it as you're speaking, and then realize like, "Oh, maybe I need to lean one way towards it or the other."
And you take into account what sort of, expectations you think that are basically targeting you in that specific social situation. So there are all sorts of things that are there. But actually, point taken. I mean, what is and this is something that I'm doing in my courses all the time, that I just try to take like rumors, fairy tales, stuff like this, and how do we delineate these things from the thing that we actually want to talk about, which is mostly, I don't know, political fake news or something like that. And it's not obvious. There are many overlaps. There are many fairy tales that were originally political conspiracy theories, for example. So when you have the, how do you call this in English? The old lady who's living at the edge and he has the giant nose and whatnot. That was an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory at the time. The witch of
like
the
a
woods.
Baba Yaga.
The witch of the woods, and these sort of stories
right.
carried, especially in Eastern Europe, a very, very strong anti-Semitic dimension. And so things over time can lose this sort of meaning, and then they just become a parallel or an allegory of a behavior that I want to elicit from someone as a mother or something. Don't go to the dark forest alone. And then the original meanings were long lost. So it's really hard to track these transformations. It's quite fascinating, but really hard to track them.
Yeah, I imagine them. We had in the last episode Christina as well. We were talking, and she also tries to make to frame her phenomena as a political power. And then in the discussion we were talking about and how political power is everywhere. Right, and it overlaps with all the different kinds of powers, but it's everywhere. So it's everything that you do. So if you're looking at political lies, you will find it everywhere that you want to look at. Because we are doing politics all the time when we are communicating. So yeah, I imagine that it's very
and it's
very hard to create this frame,
especially when you put in. This is something I didn't necessarily wanted to talk about, but when you put in propaganda, then things just become even more difficult, because I don't think there is a good definition of what propaganda is. So most people would start talking about that. You want to manipulate the other person's beliefs. That's just communication, man. That's what we're doing when we're communicating to others. We're naturally born propagandists. So I'm not entirely sure what these things really refer to.
It's interesting as well, like comedians and how they became politicized. Or they might have always been politicized. But in any case, like you take a joke.
Yeah.
And there's so much political power behind the joke.
Yeah. Especially against fear. That's the thing. That's why I like about comics that I'm also coming from a background in which like fear and politics been really, really intermingled in the past like 15 years. And the main thing against it is political comedy. Because
how do you deal with that?
I mean, that's Satyricon is a 2,200-year-old political. That's where we get the word satire.
I think it's just that people who work in politics, and especially build their political campaigns around emotions of fear and anger, can never be funny, because it requires a kind of a self-reflection that is not allowed for people who are trying to elicit fear.
That's what I'm saying. I'm saying about actual comedians who actually are funny and make political jokes.
Yeah.
Not for fear sometimes, maybe just to appeal to absurd, or maybe sometimes to make a comparison which is asymmetric, or make many different things with jokes, which is basically a lie.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And
it doesn't have to be a lie.
It doesn't have to be a lie.
Take George Carlin, for example. Everything he said was true. I mean, he makes a lot of jokes,
it's funny with Carlin, though. I mean, I was listening to him actually like 2 or 3 weeks before, and just like, if he wasn't presenting this the way I presented it, he would sound like a conspiracy theorist. It's really, really, something's really weird about old Carlin in that sense. But yeah, it's very, very funny.
Well, you can have different things. I meant lie, but maybe the word could be performance.
Yeah, it's a performance.
So
he stages it. I mean, there are a lot of comedians that literally say what's going on in the world, and it might be tragic, but because they're performing it as comedy, you laugh at it because there's nothing else you can do. And I think that's a good political comedian.
So that's what I'm saying with the lie. So I mean, it's quoted within the performance, so you can put it the tone, you can put the emotion behind, you can manipulate the punchline just to seem that well, there's a turn of emotions here. That's not what I meant before. There has to be a break of expectation, and most of the time is doing true performance and changing what you expect. That the communication package that is being delivered to is not exactly what you think there was.
Yeah.
Yes, but I think that's so far from lying or misinformation.
Actually, no. So this is what I wanted to put in. That when you're in a situation with a comic, that's a context in which you share this common ground that things should be understood in an ironic manner, not necessarily literally, but there's a joke going on, there's a break of expectation going on. Funny thing is that when people try to first categorize types of misinformation, they had to put in satire. Because sometimes people take satire and jokes literally, and then they start spreading it online thinking that is the truth. Like, you have The Onion or some other very, very famous satirical newspaper. And sometimes people would just take this content because they don't share this common ground. They don't have the nonverbal signals coming from a comic that would allow you to draw this conclusion that there is something ironic going on which should be understood at a different level or something like this. Is called context collapse in the literature, when you just derived of these signals, so you take everything literally, and you hold people accountable based on that as well. And we just cannot get rid of satire being poorly understood in the digital sphere, or jokes being poorly understood in a digital sphere.
There's an internet term for this which originated in the 90s called Poe's law, which is that without a winky face or a denotation that you are joking, any satire of a comment can be interpreted as so Poe's law is like also I've seen it used in academia, like reference in academia, because it's a very a widely known thing in the internet. But there's also the correlate, right? The inverse correlate of Poe's law, which is that the exact opposite is also true. That there's no way to tell whether something that's put out there genuinely is genuine, and that it's not necessarily satire as well. So I could say that I think lizard people run the earth. And you know me, so you know that's not true. But if I say it like I just said it, there's no way for you to know that I don't actually think that.
One very, very famous example of that from like early journalism, I mentioned this great moon hoax. So I think it was either Hearst's or Pulitzer's yellow newspaper in New York. They started running this story that there is a race of bad people living on the moon, and they provided like sketches of how they look, and they were running this story for like weeks. And at the end of it, the New York Post, I think that was the newspaper that ran the story, was the most read newspaper in the world. Now, the guy who originally wrote this story wanted this to be a joke of like the spiritualist circles that were going on in New York at the time, and he meant it as a parody. And then just everyone took it to as its literal meaning that we really found a race of bad people living on the moon, and then just went with it. The journal just went with it from that point onwards because it generated revenues. So that's
so absurd. That's kind of like how tentacle porn emerged. Censorship on penises, and people made a satire about tentacles. But censorship does funny things. You know, you never know what censorship's going to get you. But it's also interesting how you have the world's original broadcasting over radio, and they, I think, didn't caveat it in the beginning. And it wasn't like a mass hysteria, but there were some people who legitimately thought that aliens had invaded. You know, it was like a perfect time for people to be hearing there was no television yet, a radio drama about aliens invading.
Well, amazing examples anyways. But
so you have developed an expertise in misinformation and in lying in order to study sort of the cognitive mechanisms underlying information perception, potentially also belief change. What's motivating you to do that?
So how I got in contact with this whole topic was that I was working as a journalist back in Hungary. Not a very, very serious one. I was more like a very, very beginning of my career. I had certain traineeships and whatnot in different places. I dabbled a little bit in opinion journalism and essays. I quite liked writing essays, and I would have, the journal that I was writing for had this amazing artist who would provide like satirical drawings, and I really, really loved working together with him. And then journals around me and under me started closing down, and there was also a debate around 2015 onwards because of the refugee crisis about fake news, and that's sort of where my interest turned. So that's like the official answer, and the unofficial answer is that I sort of know or come to an understanding of what dishonesty and polarization do to personal relationships that you may have, and this is something that's not being discussed in the literature. Everyone is talking about how fake news alters or influences elections. No one's talking about the damage that it does to your interpersonal relationships. Grandfathers not talking to their granddaughters, fathers not talking to their sons because they just come to a different understanding of what information and what political parties should they conform to. And that is damaging, and that's sort of the thing that got me in it. And I already had this interest in my MA, and then when I came to the department, something interesting happened. That I told them that I'm interested in fake news. It seems to be a huge problem with fake news, especially in Hungary. The government is dealing in conspiracy theories, and then my supervisor just put down the original first theoretical paper on epistemic vigilance and just asked me, okay, how do you synchronize these two things? It's just we we think that people are not as stupid as we like to think, but it seems that they're acting stupidly recently. How can we, somehow synchronize these things, or is there can we synchronize it? Are we being wrong? Are the people who are thinking that fake news is a huge problem are being wrong? What's going on with this whole thing? And that's basically how it started. And sort of balancing in between two extreme opinions at the moment. That's pretty much what's happening. So there are people who think that fake news is the end of the world, and people are incredibly gullible, and they would just trust anyone, and they're stupid. But basically what they're saying is that people are stupid, really. Let's not. And
sort of a lazy opinion.
Yeah. Even if they have the capacities to check information, they're not motivated to do so, so they're just lazy reason, whatever. So there is that sort of part of the literature. And then there is this other part of the literature which is saying that human communication is really impossible without some kind of a cognitive capacity to check for the veracity of information. It just couldn't be evolutionary stable. One argument that I plan to add to this whole thing is that if we look at lying and how lying strategies and tactics evolve over time because of digitization, because of other stuff. If we look at how children learn how to lie from an early age and how they mature towards more and more elaborate, deceitful strategies, that can be taken as an implicit evidence that epistemic vigilance capacities exist. Because if we were just stupid, then we wouldn't need any elaborate strategies of lying. We can just sell whatever fabrications. We wouldn't need omission. We wouldn't need half-truths. We wouldn't need abstraction, obfuscation, and all these other types of deceitful tactics that one can use. I'm sort of like in between these two things right now, that I do think that humans have reasons behind believing what they believe. But nonetheless, there are strategies and tactics that seem to work in duping them, because these cognitive capacities are not perfect. And there are also methods to dupe the institutions as well. So I'm sort of in between these two kind of extremes. And one of the insights that I recently have is that these two sides of the literature have different goals, and they sort of talk past each other. So the people who are on the humans are stupid side, they have a sort of a political and larger social point behind their studies, behind the research. They're for a good reason, absolutely, enraged by what's going on with our inability to handle climate change. They are enraged about political developments with strengthening far right in Europe and in the US and in other places as well. And they use fake news as an explanandum of that. And the people who work within epistemic vigilance have a different goal. They're trying to understand the human mind and try to make empirically right observations about how the human mind works. And this just creates in this situation where the two sides of the literature just talk past each other because they have different goals behind it. And now I'm sort of caught in the middle of this whole thing and trying to balance these two extremes, saying that humans are not stupid, but we just trying to come up with methods that work for a period of time in the given information ecosystem. It doesn't mean that they're stupid. It's just that we're good in figuring out how to dupe people. But one thing that I'm definitely very, very grateful for, which is kind of like a moral point from my part, is that this whole epistemic vigilance taught me to think about the reasons behind people believing stuff that I would really, really not believe in, that I disagree with, and that develops my empathy. So I have loads, millions of people that I disagree with back in my home country of Hungary. I have to try to understand their reasonings of how they come to retain those beliefs. And when it comes to politics not going your way, then you would have this very intuitive explanation that, well, the people who are voting for and the people who are agreeing with beliefs that I disagree with are do this because they're stupid, they're uneducated, they're gullible and whatnot, and I'm just trying to keep myself away from that and try to understand their reasons. So that's one good sort of personal development out of me getting engaged with this whole topic, that it develops your empathy to think about the reasons why people come to believe things. Yeah.
Right on.
Yeah, just taking the chance to for you to expand on that. What do you think, or what would you wish to be the biggest impact on real world of your research? So, like, in the near future, what would you like that to be translate into real words? Like, what would be the best outcome?
I'm going to give a little bit of a weird answer to this. I imagine that not a lot of researchers would.
World peace.
Yes. So I think the best outcome of my research is that I'll become a better teacher. Honestly, that's when people talk about stuff like, I don't feel my research is having any real life impact, then go to teaching. That's going to have an immediate impact. If you're teaching 5 people, if you're teaching 35, if you're teaching 200 people, you're changing their minds in real time with good enough information that you may have collected the data for, you may not have collected it, but you've checked it. And I hope that I think my real life impact would be measured on how many people I'll be able to teach of taking another person's perspective and understanding their reasonings behind their beliefs. That would be my real life impact. I cannot really say anything about the real life impact of my research. I hope that I will get published in nice journals, and then people are going to read it and perhaps reference it, and maybe at one point someone's going to reach out to me to advise some policy on how to handle problems in social media. But I think, the actual real life impact that I'm aiming for is to become a better teacher.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
Beautiful answer. All right, cool. I think we'll probably end it there then.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Akos.
Thanks.
Thank you very much,
Thanks for
Akos.
having me.